atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by not only longtime Politics Guy host Trey Orndorff, who listeners know was a student of mine at Northern Kentucky University way back in my early days as a professor there, but also today I'm joined by another former student of mine, someone from the latter part of my time at NKU, Russ Gifford. And like Trey, after graduating from NKU, Russ went off to graduate school. He got a master's in political science from Ohio University. And also like Trey, Russ was one of the smartest students I had the pleasure of teaching during my time at NKU. But very much unlike Trey, Russ was, I'll say, a real rabble-rouser in my classes. He regularly challenged me, the authors of the stuff I assigned, all from his kind of far-left position. And honestly, he reminded me a lot of me as an undergraduate, though I was a hard right guy back then. And honestly, I was kind of a smug jerk at times, which Russ really wasn't. So I always appreciated having him in class because I knew I would have to bring my A game or suffer the consequences. So I am glad to have him here. Looking forward to having him on the show. Welcome, Russ.
Thank you, Mike.
So before we get started today, though, I do want to thank not exactly a new supporter, Andres, a longtime supporter and listener who recently increased his level of support for the show. Thank you very much. We really do appreciate it. Okay, so before we get to our main story today, which I'm sure everyone knows is going to be Minneapolis and ICE, what's happened over the last week, we did want to briefly mention a disturbing incident. On January 20th, Representative Ilhan Omar was assaulted during a Minneapolis town hall meeting by a guy who sprayed her with what apparently was apple cider vinegar. So, okay, that's weird. But anyway, the attacker was arrested and charged with third-degree assault. And after learning of the attack, President Trump said she probably had herself sprayed, knowing her. Now, Omar is one of the House's leading progressives. She became the first Muslim American elected to Congress in 2018, or Muslim American woman, I believe. And she has been a vocal critic of President Trump, and she's currently being investigated both by the Justice Department and by the House Oversight Committee for alleged financial irregularities. Now, guys, I don't want to get into Representative Omar's stances on the issues or Trump or the investigations against her, but I felt like we couldn't not comment on an attack on a member of Congress, even though, it turned out to be apparently designed to, I guess you could say, shock and irritate rather than to do serious bodily harm. So, Trey, I'll start with you. What's your take on the attack and the response from President Trump?
I mean, I guess, yeah, in a sense, really kind of yay. Not yay that an attack happened, but yay that really it's more of what you consider an enhanced protest. It crosses a line, absolutely and obviously, but you're happy to see that kind of thing as opposed to, I remember it's been a few years ago when we actually had things like threats and things going on, and so in that sense, it's not something that warms your heart. But I will say, as somebody who studies this kind of stuff, it just made me go, okay, not good, but could be a lot worse.
Yeah. Okay, Russ, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I feel that it's pretty alarming, but it's also reminiscent of, it just immediately reminded me of George Bush getting the shoe thrown at him.
That's a good analogy, actually.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's like, it's obviously not a good sign for, a congresswoman who is willing to do town halls to be assaulted, but that it's apple cider vinegar is, I guess, a net positive. Could have been worse.
Certainly could have been worse, but I think both the incident and President Trump's response says an awful lot about the times we are living through, and not much of it good, unfortunately.
Well, again, I think most of the negativity here might comes from the president, right? This could have been an easy, nothing kind of win, and instead he has to do what President Trump does best, which is sling little short missives across social media that sounds more like a petulant teenager than any member of state, and that remains the story. But I guess sometimes maybe we're a little too desensitized to the fact that a sitting president would say
Yeah.
things so callous long before we recognize that it's apple cider vinegar.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, why don't we move on then? This is also Minneapolis related, obviously our main story, and of course everyone knows that since really early January, Minneapolis has been this, I guess you call it a domestic flashpoint. That Operation Metro Surge and the deaths of Good and Preddy, and now video of that Preddy killing, which has been analyzed by multiple media outlets, really across the ideological spectrum, seems to diverge from the official account, which has, inflamed an already bad situation even more. And in the wake of that killing, increasingly intense public pressure, including from a few Republicans in Congress, has led the Trump administration to at least attempt some partial de-escalation. For instance, with operational control shifting from Border Patrol Commander Greg Bovino to Border Czar Tom Homan, and Homan this week admitting that ICE has made some mistakes and is pledging narrower enforcement moving forward. Now, President Trump, for his part, has attempted to distance himself from Bovino. He told Fox News this week, Bovino is very good, but he's a pretty out there kind of a guy, and in some cases that's good. Maybe it wasn't good here. Bovino, welcome to the underside of the bus. Anyway, Trump has also softened his stance somewhat toward Minnesota Governor Walz and Mayor Frey, saying that his conversations with them went well, and indicating at least some willingness to work with state and local officials. And on Friday, I should mention, the Justice Department announced that it will be conducting a civil rights investigation into the killing of Preddy. Though that said, Trump is still Trump, and on Friday he posted on Truth Social that Preddy was an agitator and perhaps an insurrectionist whose stock has gone way down after video was released of an earlier incident in which he kicked out the taillight of an ICE vehicle, which Trump called actions so hard and violent. Maybe not as hard as violent as 10 shots in the back. But anyway, this all happened as the clock ran out on the continuing resolution funding the Department of Homeland Security, as well as 8 other cabinet departments that haven't been funded for the rest of the fiscal year yet. And so, again on Friday, the Senate approved a measure that funded all currently unfunded agencies except for DHS, which will be funded at existing levels for 2 more weeks to give negotiators time to work out a deal. And an agreement, assuming one is reached, will almost certainly impose more restrictions on ICE agents, though how significant those restrictions will be, well, that remains to be seen. And also, there will be at least a short partial shutdown because the Senate-passed deal now has to go to the House, which is out until Monday before it goes to President Trump to be signed into law. So there we go. And why don't we just ease Russ into things? I'll start things off with you, Trey. What are your thoughts on this? Again, another just wild week in Minneapolis.
Yeah, I mean, it's the story that just keeps on going. Which, let's be honest, if I was the Republican strategist, I would want to be killing myself currently because, okay, so for example, all of this story that we're talking about right now, if we weren't dealing with the ICE thing, the story would be corrupt Mike Waltz and all of the corruption in Minnesota, and it'd be this hugely damaging story for Democrats. It is a hugely damaging story for Democrats, but it's not going to be because instead he gets to be, and rightfully so, a partial hero as he stands up to what's happening and to be negotiating with the president over what's happening in his state, right? And so this is one of those instances where I think this politically is an absolute win for Democrats. And the longer this goes on, the bigger of a win that it is for Democrats it's easily a win for Republicans if they just weren't doing the things that they were going to do. So that's the political angle. Now, on the legal angle, I think this actually, I'm going to give a lot of credit to Senator Rand Paul. I think he's kind of right on the money with a number of his analyses of what's going on here. And this is something that Ken and I have talked about on the show in other contexts. So the killing this past week, let us be clear once again that your actions on previous days, your potential status as a criminal or a not criminal, does not change your legal processes, due process, or anything else. That is what makes our legal system amazing, right? The answer is even if I am a criminal, I still get particular protections. That's what makes our democracy amazing. So had he kicked in 14, I'm not saying that's a good thing. Had he kicked in 14 bumpers and windows and anything else, that still doesn't mean that the process that he is due shifts. So that's a big deal. We've also talked, now I will say the last little kind of both, it's a legal and it's a political matter, and then I'll pause for a second, and my 3 items. Look, weapons. I recognize that this week has been the most schizophrenic week when it came to Second Amendment rights that I have seen. Suddenly, my left-leaning friends who couldn't believe that I'd ever go to a range were all getting down into the nuances of the Second Amendment and what it means you got to bring to a protest. It wasn't that long ago we were talking about, well, you don't want to bring guns to that'd be terrible. And listen, we can have that conversation, but you don't get to change that position like just on a dime because it advances you. And likewise, Republicans, my friends, he didn't pull this weapon. It is absolutely clear. He had his permit. And if we're going to take that seriously, that means he can't just instantaneously be a terrorist because he has a gun. Otherwise, I have follow-up. So that's too much for one go, but those were my 3 biggest takeaways. And so there you go.
Okay, Russ, why don't you jump in with your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I was building a response there, but I just wanted I guess we run in different circles, Trey, because my friends on the left love guns, and they have for a while. I can remember being in Cincinnati during the Black Lives Matter protests and feeling really good about the amount of people. There were a surprising amount of people who showed up armed, and I think that indicates a massive difference in how these things are being handled. But one of the more interesting things that I've sort of noticed about this, at least from the left, is to me, it feels like a failure from both sides, just outright. I mean, Tim Walz and Jacob Fry, the mayor of Minneapolis, in my opinion, have just done an absolutely egregious job of handling it. I was actually in Minneapolis on January 7th. My birthday is January 7th. I'm not that bright of a person. I go to Minneapolis on my birthday every year. And so, yeah, I wake up on January 7th. I'm like, oh, we're going to have a great day. And boom, that was shot in the foot pretty early. But yeah, Jacob Fry comes out immediately and he's, get the F out of Minneapolis. And, nothing really moved with that for quite some time. But on the right, you see disagreement amongst their own base. I mean, you have Trump taking a de-escalatory approach and Pam Bondi tweeting that nothing is going to stop President Trump in all caps, which is pretty alarming to me.
Well, can I ask you a question, Russ? Because you bring up 2 interesting points from my point of view. One is you were mentioning that in your experience, I'm no stranger to protests and to locations. Now, obviously, listeners, as a reminder, I'm in Oklahoma, so we can count. My guess is, Russ, there's probably 20 of you in my state, and you're all in Oklahoma City, right?
Yeah, I can imagine.
And I probably know half of them. Anyway, but point being is that when you were talking about that is a shift about being armed, that actually surprises me a little bit based on both the data and my personal experience. And so do you think that I kind of assumed that meant that Peretti actually might be more conservative than we originally thought, which might be interesting in terms of what's going on with Republicans. But your analysis here would seem to suggest that you think that there's a lot of people on the left who are now carrying to protests. That seems like a pretty big shift to me. I'm curious about your take on that.
I got to say, just historically, the Black Panthers were big fans of guns back in the day, and
that's true.
It's not like there's not a precedent for leftist folks to be perfectly okay with guns, But anyway, sorry, I just wanted to jump in with that.
I think Mike's spot on with that. I mean, I think there's also a very understandable fear amongst leftists to speak openly about being armed, in a state that has actively seek to dismantle every movement that they've ever attempted. I mean, even as a leftist who has, no interest in violently overthrowing the government, at least, on my own, I say that tongue in cheek as a joke, of course.
That's probably good.
Or at least not openly enough that we're going to mention it on a podcast. Right?
Yeah, no, never that. But as somebody who does hunt and who grew up on a farm and who even in my liberal days as a young 18-year-old before I, was indoctrinated or whatever, I've always appreciated the Second Amendment for what it brings, but you kind of realize quickly that when the very books that you read are seen as treacherous, of course you're not going to go around and openly talk about firearms. But I mean, I will say that I think there's a conscious shift now, but I think that conscious shift started some time ago with people having to face the choir and just say, okay, well, we need to be more comfortable with this in a world where we can be executed essentially on live stream, and then have people quickly hop on social media and justify our being executed.
Yeah.
That doesn't help at all.
Well, that raises an interesting question that we've been talking about on our Discord. For just a heads up, if you're a right level supporter, you get to be access to us on Discord. And we had a long kind of conversation going on there about protest versus kind of insurrection, and where is that line, and what does that mean, and what's the purpose of those things. And this conversation, I think, hits right into this question of, I think for a long time, this has been a question posed to the right, which is, okay, the reason you're going to have weapons isn't to protest. The reason you have weapons is because, well, you're at some point saying, hey, I've got to do something about police officers. I got to do something about the people in charge. And I hear that coming from you, Rush. And I'm not trying to say that in an inflammatory way. I'm not accusing you of being an insurrectionist or anything. But on a broader level, I do think that the Minneapolis situation brings this question to mind. So please, again, I'm not suggesting that Freddie does not have the right to have that weapon, but I do think it leads to questions that we have to answer, which is, if everybody is assuming that I need to have a weapon, what that means fundamentally is that everybody is in a more real way contemplating civil war, and not in a silly way, right? Because oftentimes be carrying a weapon to say, I'm trying to protect myself against the downtown mugger, right? Which I think sometimes is like the NRA view, right? The kind of basic NRA view.
Good guy with the gun.
Exactly. But we're in a whole different category and again, I'm not suggesting that's not the purpose of the Second Amendment, but we're in a different category when everybody's saying, hey, I'm so worried about actual law enforcement that I consider that I'm going to hold a weapon in defense of law enforcement. It's been a question on the right. It's going to be a question on the left. What do you guys think about that? It strikes me as an empirical question that we have to answer. I mean, not one we're going to fix, but
I don't think we're there. I think that's maybe overstating it a bit. I certainly think there are groups maybe on both extremes who feel that way, but I think still the vast majority of Americans are not, walking around packing heat or anything like that. And so not really contemplating civil war, just the idea of, hey, stuff happens. And if stuff happens, I want to be prepared, whether that's a smart idea or not. And certainly I think reasonable people can disagree about that. I just don't think we're there. But to me, something that's maybe gone a little bit, not maybe underreported, but under-discussed is another amendment, and that's the Fourth Amendment. Because there's been a lot of talk about when this measure to fund DHS goes to the House, a number of House Republicans are uncomfortable with warrant removal changes. And to me, and what I'm saying here is that, as many folks know, right now, ICE's apparent position is that through an administrative warrant, which ICE issues basically to itself, essentially, they can just go in to anyone's home, not just the person who owns the home who's in there illegally, but anyone. If you or I just have someone in the house that ICE has an administrative warrant against of final removal, they can go into our house with just that warrant, not a judge-issued warrant, and just break down the door and take that person away. Now, if that doesn't freak you out, this idea that an administrative internal warrant would somehow supersede the Fourth Amendment, that to me, that's something that's happening all the time now, or at least, a number of times. That kind of freaks me out. That to me is a fundamental protection that ICE just seems, and a number of Republicans in Congress seem to just say, you know what, doesn't matter that much.
Well, I mean, J.D. Vance even came out in support of it and basically said, well, it's still a warrant, but your summation of it there is perfect. But I think this goes back to that earlier question, Mike. I'm going to push back a little bit on it. You said, look, I don't think this is necessarily that kind of moment. Maybe in a pre-January 6th world, I would agreed with you. But I don't know if in a post-January 6th world, I agree with your point here that it's just kind of, hey, we don't have these potentially teetery brink moments. And this is exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Somebody breaks into your house, you have somebody end up in a gun battle with ICE agents. We haven't seen that happen yet, but I can certainly envision that scenario. And to bring us back to the funding and what you're talking about here, let's be clear. The fundamental problem that I have is no matter what Democrats get attached to this bill, what's the likelihood that ICE follows that rule anyway? We have a George W. Bush appointed judge right now who has released the most crazy district level opinion I've ever seen, where he lists out the 78 ways in which ICE is not complying with the orders just in his in his jurisdiction. What's the likelihood that suddenly, we get some kind of rider to the DAH funding bill and suddenly Bondi goes, you know what? I'm going to start complying with the law differently now. Like, I don't, I mean, don't not do it. Like, yay, let's do that. But just doing it will not necessarily fix anything. It doesn't seem like to me, given that that's one of those guardrails that seems to be at least.
Russ, what do you think?
I'm trying not to get too deep in the weeds here, but Camus sometime, and I forget the time, but it's toward the end of his life. He comes up on this moment where he says, to be intellectually honest, I have to admit it's a terrible thing, but I have to admit at some point that perhaps everything I've ever known was wrong. And I keep coming back to that point. I've been listening to the podcast for a minute, and I know like rule of law always pops up, like rule of law and the things that we have known to just be. The Trump administration, especially this second time around, has just really drawn that into question, even materially, the way that you feel the rule of law, even almost psychically. So I get too deep in the weeds on this one because I almost think that we need to be busying ourselves with creating new definitions for these things, because we already know that it's not going to apply, or we can just assume intuitively that it's not. And so the longer that I focus on it, the more frustrated I get, because
Well, can I
it's
ask
just not
Russ,
going
though,
to be there.
it doesn't feel like a moment that we want something new. It feels like what we need is a restoration of what we've had, right? Yeah, I don't want to undo. I don't want to blaze in. I mean, the Trump administration is blazing into a new future. If anything, in some ways, this libertarian feels more conservative than he ever has before in some ways, because I want a restoration of what I've seen in the past, especially when it comes to the legal precedents, others. So when you say there, hey, this makes me question everything, and I want to blaze something new, I'll be honest, I recoiled a little bit from you saying that, because that feels like it gives justification for what I want to return. I want to have a solidification of what we've had in the previous times as the rule of law.
Come on, Trey. From time to time, the tree of liberty must be watered with the blood of the patriots, right? I mean,
well, it might, but yeah. Sorry, answer that question first, Russ. I'm sorry.
I mean, I guess it depends on how you feel about the acceleration of time and the time in which we live. I would be lying if I said that I don't feel sympathetic to exactly what you're saying. I know I'm friends with Ben Burgess on Facebook, this philosophy professor at Rutgers, he's just a lefty political philosopher, writes for Jacobin, and he wrote that, like, in a very ironic way, Trump is making me feel nostalgic for the America that I used to hate. The America that I railed against it in Mike's classes, and that I spent so much energy, I would exhaust myself railing against it. Now I see these things as like the sort of, wow, you don't know what you have until it's gone. But when it's gone, it's gone. Do we, if that question were posed to me, I guess I would pose it back to you as, if I'm going to have to exhaust myself and exert my energies, do I really want to exert them nostalgically, moving backwards to a world that even you probably already knew needed some things fixed, or build one moving forward? And I mean, the left and libertarians have built plenty of coalitions throughout history. So
yeah. I hear that. And here's an area where I think sometimes Mike and I end up being a little bit closer, in that we come at it from different directions, but we both have kind of classically conservative sympathies. I think that might be a good way to put it. And so here is, broadly speaking, one of the broad, I think, positive takeaways when you take a look at, say, our origin of the United States, specifically the Constitution, is empirically, it seems to me that in moments of crises, the idea that we can build new things without regard for what had come before and been in the past has historically been tragic. And rather, what has been successful has been the more reluctant conservative revolutionary, the constitutional revolutionary, who suggests that, yes, it's worth giving up my blood there, Mike, as you glibly but rightfully, I think, point out what we ought to do, but not for the unknown cliff of perfect reason, but rather for the improvement upon what we know has worked. And so I agree with you, Russ. If anything comes out of the moments of Trump, I hope it is that we emerge better than we were before because we fix additional structural inequalities and issues. But I wouldn't want to start with a blank slate, because those kinds of blank slates in those revolutionary fervor moments, and I'm not saying we're quite there yet, but I can almost taste it as we move forward. I wouldn't want, I don't want a bunch of blank slate philosophers from any particular variant giving me their utopia. I'd want to start with what had been working and improve on upon it.
Well, it's interesting. I didn't think we would get this philosophical, but I'm kind of glad we went there. It's sort of a different way to look at it. I will say I want to pull us back to one other thing, kind of more on the ground, sort of on the ground. Actually, another aspect of this that we haven't talked about regarding immigration and ICE and so forth. But before we do that, just a quick message. When my gut is off, everything feels off. I have a weird gut. My digestion, energy, mood, even my focus. And every day your gut's fighting this silent war against processed food, stress, even stuff going on in the air. And when your gut struggles, your whole body feels it. And most probiotics, I take a probiotic, most of them never make it to your gut alive, which is why they don't work. Just Thrive Different, it's clinically proven to arrive 100% alive and deliver measurable results. Just Thrive turns your gut into an antioxidant factory, creating protective compounds exactly where you need them most. This means benefits like better digestion, healthy immunity, more energy, and easier weight management. Just Thrive probiotic comes in capsules or berry-flavored gummies, so there's an option for everyone in the family. And for over a decade, Just Thrive's been helping thousands of people take control of their health with science-backed solutions you can trust. From their award-winning probiotic to their full line of gut, immune, and brain health supplements, Just Thrive is ready to help you live your healthiest life. And you can try Just Thrive products for 90 days risk-free, and you can save 20% on your first order with code CX. See the difference for yourself or get a full product refund, no questions asked. Take the 90-day Just Thrive probiotic challenge today at justthrivehealth.com/CX. Be the best you with Just Thrive. So, guys, this other aspect I wanted to talk about, to bring up, is why the Trump administration, so concerned about immigration, obviously, hasn't focused more on the demand side of things. For instance, here's what I mean. Back in June, Border Czar Homan told the media that worksite enforcement would be massively expanded, in his words. But actually, there's really little evidence this has happened. And in fact, if you talk to employer-side immigration lawyers, they'll say, at least off the record, that actually scrutiny of employers may have actually eased off a bit in the past few months. And to be fair, it's harder to win cases against employers who hire undocumented workers, because if you do that, you have to demonstrate that an employer knowingly hired someone illegally, and all the employer has to do is demonstrate legally that there was the documents they were shown reasonably appear to be genuine. But the thing is, and I keep on coming back to this again when we talk about immigration, E-Verify, which is a system already in place, would make a big difference here, but the federal government has not mandated. Now, 23 states include some version of, will use E-Verify, but only like 8 states mandate it for, well, all or kind of nearly all employers, and mostly all states in the South. And so it strikes me as odd, not really, but it strikes me as odd in a sense that if they really care, the Trump administration, about so much illegal immigration, and we know that people are coming to the United States in part to get jobs and make money that you don't focus on the demand side of it. And yet, clearly, the Trump administration has downplayed this like crazy. I have my thoughts on why this is, but I wanted to hear from you guys on this. Why don't we, this time, Russ, why don't we start with you on this one?
Yeah. So interestingly, recently we had a work site, ICE investigation, whatever you want to call it, really a pretty minor operation in Lawrenceville, Illinois, right where I'm very nearby where I'm staying at a Toyota factory. To me, I think it boils down to this administration favoring the spectacle above all else. I mean, I think we see that in the way we see that in Trump just, I mean, hand over fist, really, in everything the man does. But, a worksite ICE operation isn't going to garner any attention. But if you send 2,000 ICE agents to a city in cosplay, army gear with, a Bovino, basically telling these guys, put yourselves in situations where you get, I don't know if you guys have seen the video, but there's a video that just came out of him, I think, in recently, the last 3 or 4 days, of him essentially telling these ICE agents to place themselves in positions or situations where they'll get touched because all they have to do is be touched to make an arrest. And so the sort of outrage and the sort of incendiary rhetoric that this administration wants to deploy, it's necessary to put these agents in provocative positions. And at a work site, you're not going to see that. But also, I think to sell that package initially, you have to find a really good reason for it before you start going door to door. And so to me, that's what it boils down to. I think this administration is all about the spectacle. And I think the spectacle is a lot larger when you're roving the streets and you can invite really protesters and whomever else.
Well, I mean, let me try to outflank you on the left here, Russ. Let me be the libertarian. I was outflanking you on the right. Let me outflank you on the left.
But Trey is all over the place today.
Coming from both angles today is no. But seriously, I mean, what movie just came out, Melania, and who backed it? Oh, Bezos. It was Amazon MGM. Oh, and what else came out this week? We didn't have enough room to talk about it, but there's going to be a whole new crypto company that's effectively owned by the Trump, but not exactly Trump because that would be illegal, but by all of Trump's family. And it's going to pick this particular currency that is also the people from over here from the UAE who wanted him to, and he just gave them a favor. So, I mean, look, I think the other answer is pretty straightforward here is that the Trump administration has a long history of grifting. And so if you went directly after companies, you would be undoing the possibility for some really good mob level grifting. And so, I mean, it doesn't negate your point, Russ, that it makes for good spectacle in a way that looks like you're doing something. But I think simultaneously, the Trump administration is not particularly interested in coming after U.S. companies. Yeah. That's not on the playbook unless it advantages Trump for some particular personalized reason to get something he or his family specifically wants. And so maybe I'm channeling my inner kin there slightly, but while he probably would take that a little bit further, I do think there's some underlying truth there that we just can't ignore empirically, right? I mean, even just this week, those two examples are not some isolated incidents that I'm pulling out of my hat. We see this happening week after week.
Yeah, I just want to say, I'll add a third kind of angle to this, is that even for employers that knowingly hire workers who should not be working in this country, the fines are tiny. For a first offense, it ranges, depending on various factors, from $700 to $5,500. Second offense, $5,500 to $14,000. Third, up to $27,000. And given that enforcement's almost nil, the cost benefit for employers is to totally do this. And it would be very simple to make meaningful fines for this. It would be very simple to set up a system that automatically cross-checks E-Verify against payroll, tax, employment records, that sort of thing. There's no political way. It's a simple system to actually use. It takes around a couple of minutes usually. So what's lacking? Well, the background of this is there are around 13, 14 million people living in the U.S. illegally, depending on whose numbers you look at. Around 9 to 10 million of them are employed. Now, if you take those folks out of the workforce, that results in, depending on, again, the figures are kind of rough, but really ballpark estimate, economic losses somewhere around $500 billion per year. In other words, everyone knows, at least most people know, we need these people working in this country. It would be economically disastrous. And so we pretend we're going after them, but actually, well, we kind of need them too. And that really puts a lot of hard-on immigration folks in a really uncomfortable position. But all of a sudden, we would find out that for a lot of jobs that we really rely on, boy, talk about inflationary effect and negative economic effects. People in this country illegally actually contribute a lot more than a lot of hard-on immigration folks are willing to admit publicly, but certainly will admit privately when business owners, when they're kind of talking amongst themselves.
Well, or just take a look. I mean, it would be the political cost of what would happen if we actually tried to deport all of those individuals. Let me just give one particular case example. This past month, Nicaragua, for one particular case, has actually ended citizenship for individuals who have crossed the border and begun working in the United States because they are now considered to be traitors. So if we actually ship those people back, we're shipping them back to actual death because they don't actually have a home country anymore. Again, that's just one particular state. The political ramifications of some of these things, I don't think people recognize how complicated they really are. And again, I'm going to outflank you on the left and just say, look, it's time to stop worrying about this stuff. If people want to live in the United States, let's just make it really, really easy. We just come on in, get your hand stamped, come join the United States. We'd love to have you because if you're here, that means you didn't want to be somewhere else and that you like us better. Win. Let's do it. And then if you commit some crime, we'll worry about it then. But again, if we're just going to roll the dice, the likelihood that the person who gets their hand stamped is going to be a criminal is, I believe, 1/5 as likely as my white neighborhood in suburbia. So I'll take those odds. But I know that I'm on the outside. I can hear everybody yelling at me now from both sides. Trey, you crazy. And that's fair.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Yeah. Russ, what do you think on this one?
Well, I think that's what's so fundamentally funny about being somebody who tries to remove themselves from the theater that is American politics. Is you see with immigration, at least in particular, a lot of people who are at one point or on one, one half of their head are incredibly small government. We want the administrative appendages of the state to be very tiny, but also we want immigrating here legally to be very difficult and very strenuous and tedious. And I can tell you, as someone who almost moved to Canada, not for political reasons, but educational ones, that like it's a very taxing process to attempt to immigrate somewhere. It's very difficult even for me as a citizen of this state, and I know Canada is difficult, but the United States is already an incredibly difficult country to legally immigrate to. I met too many foreign students throughout my life, and I've had that conversation too many times. So I think there's obviously like the cost of labor and that gets me back to the spectacle to kind of touch on your point, Trey, and to agree with you. Yeah, I mean, if I needed a reason, if I needed a patsy, I would say that I was going for immigration, and I would look at labor, and then I would just I would do these massive operations in the Midwest while entirely ignoring my original point, because obviously these people know that migrants, legal or illegal, play a vital role in our economy. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I just find it funny for small government people to
Well, yeah,
simultaneously favor the administrative
Well,
component of immigration in this country, which requires such a massive amount of time and effort and labor.
I think that's because most people, or a lot of people, a lot of the time, may claim that they're acting out of some sort of consistent ideology, but what they really want is the results that they want, essentially. And so if the Second Amendment becomes inconvenient or the Fourth Amendment becomes inconvenient to my goals, well, then, we can kind of put that to the side. But all of a sudden, when it's something that helps me, well, yeah, I'm a big second, fourth, whatever, pick your amendment kind of guy, essentially. And that's hardly surprising.
But I don't think the small government guys are around anymore. I think we're railing. I mean, that's not the ideology of Republicans, right? Republicans have shifted. I think we might be a little bit intellectually behind the times making that kind of argument. I would suggest that the current kind of Republican ideology isn't about small government. It's about small government in everything but military and police. And there we want to have massive investments and large governments. And I'll be honest, it seems likely, and I haven't quite placed this. I was just teaching a political ideology class. It's one of the reasons that Justin and I have been doing that on our bonus shows. But to me, one of the things that we're seeing here is this idea of the small government is an antiquated ideological. I think there is a more consistent position. I think those of us who view it for a long time, though, don't always quite see it because we're used to thinking of the right as being the small government guys.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been for 25 years.
Back to the politics of this thing, there's been some. It does clearly, I made a joke about this in the open, that it does seem like Bovino's been sort of thrown under the bus because you need a scapegoat for that sort of thing. If you've been follow any of the really top Trump administration folks on social media, it's all about owning the libs, essentially. And certainly Kristi Noem's been front and center on that. And there's been some talk about him firing her. I don't think it's going to happen for a couple of reasons. Number one, Trump doesn't want Democrats to feel that they got a scalp out of this, a top administration person. And number two, I don't think Trump or anyone really wants to sort of bruising confirmation fight for a new agency head that would certainly be much closer to the midterms and would give Democrats a lot more opportunities to sort of publicly. So I think it kind of ends with Bovino, and that's going to be about the biggest scalp that Democrats get, if that's the sort of thing you're concerned about, sort of thing. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Especially with Walsh coming up. You don't need another confirmation when you're already trying to get your Fed chair. 100%. 100% agree in this case.
Yeah. Russ, any thoughts on that?
I agree with Trey as well.
All right. Well, I somehow think that next week on the show, we'll be talking more about Minneapolis at ICE. Though I will say that, a few weeks ago, I think I said, I just cannot envision Donald Trump de-escalating, but it sure does look like he made moves in that direction. And this is one of these instances where if I am proven wrong on this, and I sure hope I am, I will be so glad to be proven wrong. But time will tell. We'll see what happens. And I am sure that this is not the last we will be talking about Minneapolis and ICE. All right, moving on. On this segment, Russ is going to sit this one out, but Trey, I know you're always up for a good monetary policy conversation. So here's the deal. You mentioned this. President Trump recently nominated Kevin Warsh, a former Federal Reserve governor, to be the next Fed chair. Warsh was actually under consideration for the job by Trump in 2017, and he's also been a vocal critic of the Fed's recent approach, and he's actually called for lower interest rates. So, of course, Trump loves that. And when he announced the nomination on Truth Social, Trump wrote, I've known Kevin for a long period of time and have no doubt he will go down as one of the great Fed chairmen, maybe the best. On top of everything else, he is central casting, and he will never let you down. Now, the nomination now will go to the Senate, of course, at a time when the Fed's independence been under more than a little scrutiny. And if he's confirmed, then Warsh will succeed current Fed leader Jerome Powell, whose term as chair, but importantly, not as a Fed board member, expires in May. So, Trey, what do you think about this nomination?
Well, I think one thing we have to be aware of is that despite his alignment currently with Trump on lower policy, Walsh is not some out of the woods crazy guy. He has he had been on the Fed board before. As a matter of fact, the reason he left the first time was he was worried that the Fed was taking on too much debt to bring down long-term interest rates. And to be frank on that front, I actually would agree with Walsh, right? At the time, it moved from about $238 billion to $9 trillion at the highest point there in taking on long-term debt, which was basically a fancy way of doing monetary easing without changing the monetary easing, right? And so it seems likely to me, in a world in which Trump does a lot of you just think, what has just happened today? I think, in all honesty, you could do a lot worse than Walsh. Now, he isn't a PhD in economics, and I recognize that is one of the kind of complaints against him. The other, and I think rightfully so, is he's already kind of come out in favor of bringing down interest rates at a time when we still haven't tamed inflation. Look, let's just be honest about that. We're not down at our 2% target. However, he wants to do that at the same time as he is selling other assets, and that's never happened before. So I'm gonna give him a little bit of leeway and say that combination is probably not as bad as I think some individuals are suggesting. And this is coming from me, a guy who is worried about monetary policy. I will say, though, we have to be thoughtful. It doesn't seem like the market itself collectively is particularly happy with this. We'll notice markets were down sharply after his announcement. But it's hard to say if that's really related to him or if it's just related to the fact, is the Fed going to be independent anymore?
Yeah.
Because, and we can talk more about that in a second, but that's where I start, Mike. What do you feel on that front? Because again, it could be worse, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, here's the weird thing about Warsh. He was a big time inflation hawk during his time on the Fed. And
very much so.
A big, I hate easy money kind of guy. But recently he said, well, the Fed should actually cut rates faster, which seems kind of schizophrenic. And so here's sort of the best sort of steelman argument for that position. Now, a cynic might say, well, he's just telling Donald Trump what he wants to hear so he can become Fed chair. And okay, maybe that's true, maybe that's not. But here's sort of the analytical argument for it. What he's saying is he wasn't wrong in the past to not be for rate cutting. But things are different now because the inflation problem we have now is currently driven less by overheated demand, and that would push against rate cuts because rate cuts will boost demand, but rather the inflation we're seeing now is being pushed more by policy changes that are supply-based, things like overly restrictive housing, overly restrictive land use regulation, tough energy permitting, and regulations that kind of hold back infrastructure development. And so in this kind of environment, if the Fed cuts rates, well, that doesn't really get at the real problem. And in fact, it can make things worse if they don't cut rates by weakening demand at the same time that you have supply bottlenecks. And so in the process, you make it more expensive to finance the government debt. And this is a big deal. The national debt currently around $38 trillion. Roughly, for every 1% rate decrease by the Fed, that translates into, again, super rough estimate, around $100 billion per year in financing that debt saving. So that's not nothing, okay? I don't know that I entirely buy that argument, but it's not an intellectually incoherent argument. And so for people saying, well, Warsh was this big inflation hawk, but now he's a Trump guy, I'm not entirely sure about that.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think about that, Trey.
I would suggest that once he gets onto the Fed, it doesn't appear to me that he's going to be somehow radically different than the person he's been historically. And so I'm with you, Mike. Even if we have some disagreements in his policies, it doesn't feel like he's a Trump sycophant. I think what has actually happened, if somebody said, look, give me the perfect model, I think his position happens to align perfectly in this moment with what Donald Trump wants. And Donald Trump he's this schizophrenic kind of guy, right? His attention is here, his attention is there. What's going to happen? And I think his attention moved. He sees that, and that's the fundamental issue here. So I don't think it's a Walsh. I think it's a Trump.
Yeah. And, when we look to confirmation, I think there's a really good chance he will be confirmed. But this is, again, an example of Trump getting in his own way because the big holdup is going to be on the Senate Banking Committee. Now, Republicans right now have a 13-11 majority, but retiring Senator Tillis, who's retiring, has said he's going to he's on the Banking Committee, will hold up any voting to advance any Fed nominees until the Department of Justice is completely done with its investigation of Powell. Now, there are ways that the Senate could kind of force that nomination to the floor without the recommendation of the Banking Committee, but they're probably not going to want to do that, so that would certainly at least slow things down. Not only that, but Powell actually, according to some reports, may be leaning towards staying on the Fed after his term as chair ends, because his actual board member term doesn't end until the end of January 2028. And this is kind of a rare thing if Powell decides to stay on, because since 1935, which is when the current system came into place, essentially the current structure, out of the 10 Fed chairs that could have stayed on once their chairmanship was over. Only 2 have actually done that. But the thinking here is that Powell might just be saying, you know what, I'm not going to step down because I'm not going to give Donald Trump another nomination, not because Powell's trying to stick it to Trump, but because Powell really cares about the Fed's independence here. And so I really think we saw a lot of this in the first term. It's not surprising here that sometimes Donald Trump's bombastic nature ends up really boomeranging on him, especially in institutions that I would argue are still at least somewhat conservative in how they move and their traditions, like the Senate. What do you think, Trey?
Well, listen, I am not a fan of the underlying economic model of the Fed, right? We've talked about this on the show.
Mhm.
However, if you're going to have a Fed, its independence from politics is so absolutely crucial for even imperfect, functioning that I think it's really hard to understate both the attacks on Powell and the attack to attempt to remove a federal board member that's been heading to the Supreme Court is. I think that's easy to downplay. And so I'm with you. In some ways, the Tillis move could seem to be frustrating, but I'm actually a fan of that move. I think it is worthwhile. And I would also like to see Powell stay on. I recognize that's a break with precedent, but it's not actually a break with the law. It's not a break. His term continues. So it's not as if we're doing something that one could not do. We would be changing a norm slightly, but it would be worrisome if the norm that does die is the idea that the Fed is not going to have independence. Because if you think that the kind of the sky is falling Paulian types are a little crazy, just wait until each president can actually reach their hand into Fed policy and decide to tickle those strings however they want to. And I think all of us will be a pretty much an in the Fed people before you know it. The reason it doesn't happen that way right now is because of that independence. So I like the Tillis move, and I hope that Powell in this particular instance breaks not what he can do, but that precedent in order to preserve, I think, a more important precedent, which is the independence from presidential interference in that sense.
Yeah. And sort of to me, the kind of meta irony, I guess, here is that Warsh has argued really for years, for more than a decade now, that the Fed has essentially been bailing out bad fiscal policy. And in doing so, it calls its own credibility into question. But the point here is it seems like that's exactly what lowering rates at the insistence of Trump and the pressure on these Fed governors, not just Powell, but of course Cook as well, would be doing on that credibility issue.
Absolutely.
And I don't think Trump cares about the credibility of the Fed. He just wants the rates that he wants. And in fact, back in December, he told the Wall Street Journal, you know what? I think the rate should be at 1% or even lower. And that to me is just bananas.
Well, I mean, again, this is a man who doesn't understand. I mean, how many businesses has he bankrupted? So, I mean, look, let's put him aside. Let's be honest, empirical little quants for 2 minutes. You don't get to lower interest rates at the same time as you want to have the biggest sets of tariffs in the history of mankind. That is not how this works empirically. Look, and here you want to know how we can know that? I can just say that and just say there's no other. You go talk to a Keynesian, or you come over and talk with a Misesian, or you talk to anybody in between, and they're all of them are going to agree and say, actually, this doesn't work. And so my answer is if you can get an entire discipline that has such a divide in it over these kinds of policy matters and say, here's what the data says, I am inclined to believe that they have that pretty well fixed, or have that down. And so that's that. And you're right. So that's the fundamental problem here. This is empirical insanity to try to say I'm going to be raising tariffs, I'm going to be increasing, especially at a time when we don't have time for it on the show, but here when we know that RAM and other kinds of prices are going up as a result of artificial intelligence, which is going to push on those same kind of tariff levers. There is nothing. There is not a shred. I mean, you might as well be running around thinking there's chemtrails, right? That's the level of we can put both of those at the same time. So there we go. There's my.
I like it. I think empirical insanity is a great note to end on. So we will do that. And hey, if you felt that anything that Trey or Russ or I said was empirical insanity, we want to know about that. You can, or just if you just have a comment, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. If you're old school, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com, but also Facebook or X. We'll always put links in the show notes. And of course, if you are a supporter, there is our Discord discussion forum, which I am on all the time. Trey's on all the time. I jump on there all the time. So that's a lot of fun, certainly can be. And if you're a supporter, you also get ad-free versions of everything we release and that full-length midweek episode instead of just that 15-minute preview as well. And as always, we put those support links in the show notes. And if Patreon's not your thing to support us, well, you can do it through PayPal, Venmo, or just, send us wads of unmarked cash. We'll work with that as well. Anyway, if you would like to get that full-length midweek episode, but you're just not financially at a point where you can support us, we totally get that. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will make sure you get that full midweek episode every single week. And whether you support us financially or not, it really does help if you can just take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the show on whatever podcast app you're listening on, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And before we go, as always, I want to say visually a very special thanks to our wonderful executive producers. They are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, and Jody Marie Miller. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,